welcome to Lindenwold. This year looks a bit different at Martin Van Buren's home, but we're still excited to bring the stories of our nation's 8th president to you. And that's why we are pleased to announce our virtual speaker series for the summer of 2020. We are bringing the latest scholarship from Martin Van Buren's home straight to the comfort of yours. Thank you for joining us. Hello, and welcome to the second installment of the Park's virtual summer speaker series. This month marks the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, which enshrined in the Constitution women's right to vote. Women were involved in politics long before they were able to cast their vote at the ballot box. They were leaders in reform movements from the nation's founding. Women advocated for political causes through organizing meetings and protests, putting pen to paper, educating the next generation, and having honest conversations with relatives and loved ones. Today, we are joined by historian Michelle Dempsey, who will share her research on the lives of Angelica Singleton Van Buren and Christina Cantine, two women who had a profound influence on Martin Van Buren's life and politics. Michelle conducted her research as part of the Park's 19th Amendment Centennial Internship, with the generous partnership of the American Conservation Experience's Cultural Resource Diversity Internship Program. The work did not end in August of 1920. Many women remained unable to exercise their right to vote due to systemic racism, voter suppression, and discriminatory laws and practices. The fight for an equitable society continued. It continues today. As we remember this momentous step forward, a culmination of the tireless work of generations of suffragists, we must also look to the future. What can we do to ensure a more perfect union for all? We hope you enjoy the lecture, and thank you for joining us in commemorating this anniversary.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for listening to this talk on two women who were influential in the life of Martin Van Buren, Christina M.C. Cantine, Van Buren's niece, and Angelica Singleton Van Buren, his daughter-in-law and presidential first lady. I first learned about these two fascinating women as the AmeriCorps National Park Service 19th Amendment Centennial Research Intern for the site. I spent 6 months conducting research on the women in Van Buren's life, learning about their lives and personalities as individuals, their connection to Van Buren, and what these things all mean in examining 19th century American New York society. I had the privilege to research letters, journals, various archives, piecing together the puzzle that is the history of this family, and creating an archive of resources for the park. This research will go on to inform future interpretation at the site, highlighting their significant influence in Van Buren's life. Let me preface this discussion by stating that when you get to know historical figures, it can be quite easy to fall into calling them by first name, which is not the norm in history writing. However, as we are discussing members of the same extended family, I'll be discussing various folks with the last name Cantine, Hoos, and Van Buren, and quite honestly because it feels very strange to me at this point to refer to them by last name. I will call these women by their proper names for the duration of this talk. I will begin with the slightly elder of the two, Christina Mariah Cynthia Cantine. Christina was born in Catskill, New York in 1802 to Moses I. Cantine and Christina Hoos Cantine, who was the sister of Van Buren's wife Hannah. Moses I. Cantine was well known and respected in his community, having been the secretary of the Board of Trustees for Catskill Academy, serving for both houses of the New York State Legislature, and later editing the newspaper The Albany Argus. Not much is known of Christina's mother, also named Christina, but it was at the Cantine family's home in Catskill where Hannah and Martin Van Buren married in February of 1807. By 1813, Christina was attending school in Catskill. This school taught scientific subjects such as geography, which was then considered a science, as well as the more feminine accomplishments like sewing, drawing, and dancing. We know this because I was able to find that Christina had sewn a map sampler, which displays the East and West hemispheres embroidered in silk, with fancy penmanship labeling various countries. At the bottom is inscribed, Christina M.C. Cantine, Catskill, 1813. Women's education expanded in this period as female schools meant to teach a variety of useful subjects, as well as the ornamental, began emerging across the nation, such as the Albany Female Academy, incorporated 1814, and Emma Willard's Troy Female Seminary, incorporated 1821. Christina was very intelligent and was eventually recommended by her minister to become a principal's assistant for Miss McDonald's School for Young Ladies in Ithaca in 1828, which she declined for reasons unknown. Advertisements for the school indicate that it was a school with a fine reputation for both educational and moral instruction. By November of 1824, she had lost both her parents. Her father died in Albany in January, and her mother followed by the fall. She felt the loss of her parents deeply. She wrote to her dear friend Caroline Ludlow the following year while staying with her family in Ithaca. She reflected her joint sorrow and delight that her Uncle John Cantine reminded her so much of her father, stating, "He resembles my dear father in his looks, but more, infinitely more, in his actions and conversation. This, though it endears him to me the more, makes me feel deeply, sometimes even agonizingly, my loss. I have not looked at him for hours, particularly in the evening, when he always reads, till I've almost fancied it was my own dear parent. Sometimes, too, his voice, when speaking to me, he always calls me his child, has made me almost spring from my feet. You will hardly believe me, but I cannot bear at times to have my uncle out of my sight." Christina was very close with her parents and was an only child. She was fortunate, however, to have a large network of extended family, who she remained close with until her death in 1883. When her mother died, Christina was left in charge of her mother's estate in Kinderhook, but for the next many decades, she most often spent her time between Kinderhook, Catskill, and Ithaca, New York. Kinderhook continued to hold a special place in her life, as she frequently referred to it with endearing epithets such as "our dear little village" and "the loveliest spot on the face of the earth." She stayed with members of her father's family, mostly based in Ithaca, her mother's family, as well as Van Buren's family. She spent her time visiting friends and family, shopping, attending church and church events, reform activities, and religious revivals. Christina was very religious and is representative of many women living in upstate New York at the time who were caught up in the fervor of the Second Great Awakening, a movement of evangelical Christianity which emerged in the nation from the late 18th into the first half of the 19th century. Upstate New York, in particular, experienced a surge in evangelical activity, which helped it earn the nickname the Burned-Over District, as revivalism swept through the region like a wildfire. Throughout her letters, Christina refers to her own religious activities, as well as those taking place throughout the region. She writes about attending these revivals, hosting sewing circles to raise funds for revival activities, and missionaries, and reading the works of Charles Grandison Finney, who was a leading Presbyterian minister at the time. In 1828, Christina joined the First Presbyterian Church in Ithaca, New York, quite the departure from the Dutch Orthodox Church she was baptized into at birth. We have reason to believe that her conversion began to take place in Kinderhook, as she wrote to Caroline, "I've spent many of the happiest hours, how too I have drank deeply of the cup of affliction, how we have buried my dear last earthly parent, and here, I trust, I have found a heavenly one that will never leave nor forsake me, who will be near me in all my wanderings to guide and to uphold me." For Christina, Kinderhook represented the place where she lost her last earthly parent, but found a heavenly father, perhaps another reason she remained so fond of the town for many years. Christina's faith informed her actions throughout the rest of her life, especially as she took part in various reform activities of the day. Christina was anti-slavery, anti-alcohol, and anti-Indian removal. She was passionate, full of conviction for helping to right the moral wrongs in her country. She wrote frequently of these views, which were expressed clearly to friends and family. We know that she did confront her Uncle Van Buren about her beliefs, unlike his, concerning the topic of Indian removal. In his autobiography, Van Buren writes that he and Andrew Jackson, who were then campaigning for election for vice president and president respectively, stayed briefly with Christina, who he referred to as a lady of remarkable intelligence and strength of character, and deeply imbued with religious feeling. Van Buren noted that as they were passing through Western New York, Christina challenged Van Buren on his Indian removal policies, with what he called the tenacious grasp with which her opinions and matters of conscience were held. After some discussion, Christina declared as she shut the door behind her, "Uncle, I must say to you that it is my earnest wish you may lose the election, as I believe that such a result ought to follow such acts." Christina was unafraid to make her position on Indian removal known to her uncle, a man with power political influence. Christina also clearly expressed anti-slavery views. It is quite probable she discussed her feelings about slavery with Van Buren, who notoriously walked a fine line in neither personally defending nor promoting the institution. In his 1837 presidential inaugural speech, Van Buren stated he would not touch the subject. Christina reflected on reading this speech in the newspaper, writing, "When I took up the paper to read his address, my eye happened to light on that obnoxious paragraph in relation to slavery, and I at once laid it aside, sick at my very heart. We know these beliefs carried into her personal life, as Christina helped run a Sunday school for Black children in 1828, 1 year after New York State finalized its gradual abolition of slavery. She wrote about friends assisting with an adult Black Sunday school as well. Although we do not know much about these schools, Christina remarked, "Some of the children are very interesting and appear very desirous of receiving instruction. Others are mischievous and heedless and try our patience to the utmost. The school has not been established long enough to say much of our prospects yet. We make it a subject of our daily prayers." Christina appeared to continue to hope for her uncle's conversion and for using his political influence for the good of the country. In 1838 in Ithaca, she was recognized by someone at a church gathering as Van Buren's niece. A man approached her and explained that he had hoped for Van Buren's religious conversion. She reflected on the incident, writing, "What means this anxiety in the hearts of Christians for him, especially strangers who do not know him? I cannot but hope that God means to convert him and use him as an instrument to advance his glory on the earth." Not only does this passage reveal Christina's hope for converting her uncle, but also that she was recognized as an influential figure in the president's life. We know that Christina herself did not give up hope for Van Buren, as she gifted him a Bible for his 70th birthday in 1852. One of the several handwritten inscriptions reads, "O Lord, stir up thy strength and come and help us. Take and defend our country in this, its hour of peril," as Christina pointed her uncle's attention toward the sectional crisis and growing divide within the United States. Perhaps one of the most important discoveries I made while conducting this research is that Angelica Singleton Van Buren, Van Buren's daughter-in-law by his son Abraham, was potentially not Van Buren's first choice for First Lady. Christina's letters to her close friend Caroline revealed that on multiple occasions in his early political career, Van Buren had asked Christina to be the hostess of his household. In July of 1828, while Van Buren was serving in D.C. as U.S. Senator from New York, and only 5 months before he left office to become governor of New York, Van Buren had asked Christina to come and stay with him in Albany. She wrote to Caroline in anxiety about the situation. "I cannot bring myself to consent. I would cheerfully make a sacrifice of my own feelings for his gratification if I thought I could do it consistently. But do you not think, my friend, that I would be putting myself in the way of temptation by going to Albany? And could I go there and then with confidence pray, 'Lead me not into temptation'? I wish your advice on this subject. I wish to comply with all his requests as far as I consistently can, that I might have the greatest influence over him and, if possible, bring him to reflection. But I dare not, even to accomplish this desirable object, endanger my own peace and bring guilt on my conscience." Although it is unclear whether Christina had been offered the place of hostess by this point, she clearly felt uncomfortable with the prospect of simply being surrounded by New York's political society. She also voiced her deep concern for wanting to please her uncle while feeling incompatible with the culture she would encounter in Albany. By October of 1828, however, it is clear that Van Buren had indeed wanted Christina to become his hostess while he operated as governor of New York from Albany. Again, seeking counsel, wisdom, and comfort from her friend, Christina related her concerns to Caroline once more. "Uncle Van Buren has been trying to prevail on me to stay and make it my home with him. I told him very plainly my reasons for not accepting of his offer. I could not consent to live as he would wish to have me. He would expect me to do things that would be repugnant to my feelings and my principles. He said I might live as retired as I chose, except he should expect me to entertain ladies when they came, and during the winter, he should be obliged occasionally to make evening parties. And then, of course, it would be expected that I should be present, that is, when the ladies visited. I told him my feelings on the subject. He said he thought me too precise, too strict in my notions. I never had my feelings more tried in my life. I hardly knew it was my duty. For a moment I thought perhaps I may be useful here. I thought I may be shrinking from my duty and being so unwilling to stay. But as soon as I was left alone and could collect my thoughts, I felt convinced that it was best not to go. The tide against me at Albany would be too strong for me to stem, and I should get into a more cold, insensible state than I now am. And I might in time take delight in those very things I now consider sinful." As this passage clearly outlines, Christina had many reservations against serving as her uncle's hostess in Albany. Some of these reservations can perhaps be explained from her religious and reform-minded lifestyle. Perhaps she feared the culture of drinking that was so prevalent in early American life. Perhaps Christina feared navigating the drama and intrigue of American elite society. And perhaps she was simply anxious about the idea of playing hostess to so many prominent people. Although Christina outlined these concerns to Caroline in person, she remains vague in this letter. What is evident, however, is that she felt a deep internal struggle in rejecting her uncle's offer. She felt duty-bound to help him, but worried about what she would be asked to do. However, she ultimately concluded that taking up home in Albany would lead her to temptation, and she rejected her uncle's request. Despite their socio-political and religious differences, Christina held a special place in Van Buren's life, and we now understand that it was Christina Cantine who he first sought to fill the shoes of hostess of his household. Now we question whether Angelica Singleton was the president's first choice of First Lady. He clearly saw Christina in that role in his early political career, but 10 years later, Angelica became First Lady at the young age of 21. We don't know whether Van Buren asked Christina again, or if he deferred to Angelica straight away. Perhaps he knew Christina would say no, or perhaps he saw that Angelica's background and education would make her a suitable White House hostess. One last theory is that this choice was a political strategy. Angelica was from a prominent family from South Carolina. Her marriage to Van Buren's son Abraham could have been a way for the president to help bridge long-standing social and political differences between the North and South. We haven't found any documentation regarding this matter yet, but these new discoveries definitely add complexity to our understanding of Van Buren's personal and political relationships. We have wondered here at the Van Buren site why it was that he seemed to favor Christina, who he often referred to as his excellent niece. We know he gave twice as much money to her in his will than his other nieces, a nice sum of $200. For years, it was assumed that it was perhaps because of Christina's connection to Van Buren's wife, Hannah, that made Christina so dear to him. Her mother was Hannah's sister. He famously never remarried after Hannah's death from tuberculosis in 1819. He never mentioned her in his autobiography, nor in his personal correspondence. And it does not appear that he really mentioned her among his family throughout the rest of his life, according to a letter from Angelica to Christina. Angelica wrote to Christina in 1868, asking for recollections of Hannah. Someone had approached Angelica asking for details on a book of American First Ladies. So Angelica wrote to her cousin-in-law, "Mrs. Van Buren died when her children were so young that I believe they remember but little more than I know myself, and I know only that which Mr. Van Buren related to me from time to time." Whether because of Christina's close relationship with Van Buren, or the simple fact that she was older than Van Buren's own children, a teenager, when Hannah died, Angelica wrote, "I can think of no one more likely than you to possess the desired information." Christina did, in fact, give a statement on Hannah, which was later printed in Laura C. Holloway's The Ladies of the White House in 1881. We've also recently discovered that Van Buren was very close with her father, Moses Cantine, of whom he wrote in 1859, "I certainly never knew a worthier man or purer patriot, who stood second to no one in my esteem, and whose memory I can never cease to honor and cherish." Christina had approached Van Buren with a request. Someone was writing a brief account of the life and character of Moses I. Cantine Esquire, and Christina was hoping that Van Buren would be able to provide the man with an anecdote to include. In this letter, Van Buren clearly outlines that their close relationship was not simply the result of their being related by marriage. He stated that he and Moses were engaged together in important professional concerns, and having been also brothers-in-law, they cultivated for many years the closest personal and family relation. He added, "I could safely say there is not a single occasion in the course of our long and personal political or intercourse on which there was the slightest interruption of our friendship, or on which I would have desired him to act otherwise than he did." Thus, Van Buren's affection for his niece could be attributed to the deep affection he felt not only for her personally, but for both of her parents as well. Christina was an important member of Van Buren's family. She remained a close confidant with Van Buren's sons, daughters-in-law, and granddaughters. We have learned much from letters both to and from these relatives, which reveal that Christina, as an older cousin, was viewed as a confidant and close friend. Letters from Henrietta Eckford Irving Van Buren, second wife of Van Buren's son Smith, to Christina revealed to us Smith's anxiety and denial about the declining health of Smith's son Edward, who died of tuberculosis abroad in 1873. Letters from Ellen James Van Buren, Smith's daughter by his first wife, Ellen King James Van Buren, explain that young Ellen viewed her older cousin as a spiritual mentor. Letters from Anna Van Buren, John's daughter by wife Elizabeth Vanderpool Van Buren, unveil much about John, Anna, and cousin Ellen James's travels throughout Europe, including one instance where Anna writes about John speaking Dutch to someone. Perhaps Van Buren did speak Dutch around his children. And as I mentioned previously, we learned that Christina was perceived by Angelica to have had a close relationship with Van Buren's wife Hannah before her passing. There is so much more I could relate about Christina, her life, and her experience as a woman in upstate New York, but I believe it is now time to turn to Angelica Singleton Van Buren, who provides a supremely interesting contrast and character study to Christina, and who lived a very different life from that of her husband's cousin. Angelica Singleton Van Buren was born in 1816 to Richard Singleton and Rebecca Travis Coles Singleton from Sumter County, South Carolina, owners of one of the wealthiest cotton plantations in the state. As a member of the planter aristocracy of the South, Angelica was educated among some of the best schools. First at Columbia Female Academy of South Carolina from 1826 to 1830, and finishing at Madame Gerlaud's French School in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Like Christina before her, it appears that Angelica's education was reflective of a nationwide movement for more thorough female education, focusing on a wider variety of topics such as writing, arithmetic, grammar, modern ancient geography, astronomy, globes, rhetoric, logic, natural and moral philosophy, history, composition, and the French language. According to an advertisement for the Columbia Female Academy, its offerings also included music, drawing, velvet painting, needlework, embroidery, etc., which would round out a female's education. At Madame Gerlaud's, Angelica was elected to the Queen of May for their May Day celebration in 1831, an honor attributed to students who exhibited excellence in education and accomplishment. After finishing with school, Angelica spent the social season in Washington, D.C. with her sister Marion. This represented Angelica's coming out in American society, an adaptation of the European tradition, which in this case included a visit to the president. They stayed with their mother's sister, Sally Cole Stevenson, as well as U.S. Senator William Campbell Preston and former First Lady Dolly Madison, both relatives of Angelica's mother. In March of 1838, Angelica was introduced to Abraham Van Buren at a private White House dinner. Dolly Madison, her mother's cousin, brought Angelica along. That November, Angelica and Abraham were married at Angelica's family's plantation. In the spring, she and Abraham took a delayed honeymoon tour around Europe, and they were introduced to royalty such as France's King Louis Philippe and Britain's Queen Victoria. Upon her return, Angelica fully became Van Buren's First Lady. Her thorough elite education would have prepared her quite well for making intelligent conversation, as well as organizing the logistics of large dinners and parties. She hosted the 1840 New Year's Day open house, and according to contemporary sources, she modeled her reception of guests after the European tradition. Angelica remained seated on a raised platform rather than personally greeting her guests. This more distant reception could be attributed, however, to the fact that she was pregnant at the time and perhaps felt more comfortable sitting. Her daughter died shortly after her birth at the end of March. This type of reception did not help her reputation, whatever reason she actually had for receiving her guests in that way. The public believed Angelica to be too fond of the lavish lifestyle of the European aristocracy, an opinion made much more prominent due to the economic downturn of the Panic of 1837. Rumors of costly plans for the house and gardens were publicly criticized by Pennsylvania Representative Charles Ogle, whose famous gold spoon oration referenced Angelica not by name, but in context, as he stated, "In regard to the progressive improvement of the grounds and garden of the president, various suggestions have recently been made, and particularly by individuals whose taste and nice discrimination in matters of luxury and refinement have been greatly improved by a visit to the magnificent gardens at the Palace of Versailles and to some of the rich and sumptuous parks and gardens belonging to the Crown of England." Ultimately, such opinions prevailed against Van Buren's administration, and he lost his re-election bid in 1840 against Whig Party nominee William Henry Harrison. After leaving the White House, Van Buren moved to Lindenwold, and Angelica and Abraham moved with him. Angelica ran Lindenwold as hostess until she, Abraham, and her children, Singleton, born in 1841, and Martin, born in 1845, moved to New York City in 1848. Letters between Angelica and her mother revealed the attention to detail necessary for running the home of a man who, although no longer president, remained significantly active in American political life. In 1840, Angelica wrote to her mother asking advice in preparing for the move to New York. "First, I want you to send me a list of the supplies, such as you usually send to Charleston in the fall when the house is out of everything. I want it as a guide in ordering groceries, etc. for Lindenwold, and have put an imperfect idea of the quantities of sugar, etc., especially for 6 months' consumption with a regular family of 4, and I fear a great deal of strange company stopping by all through summer en route to Saratoga, etc., to see the president and Smith and John and various other friends on long visits. Van Buren ran for president twice more, once under the Democratic ticket in 1844 and once under the Free Soil ticket in 1848. During this time, Angelica would have remained significantly busy as both manager of her father-in-law's household and mother to 2 young boys. Angelica's management of Van Buren's home not only necessitated attention to important guests, but also the running of a household of servants. Although we do not have details about Angelica's relationship with Van Buren's servants at Lindenwold, her travel journals of 1854 to 1855 reveal her to be often frustrated with the details of finding good help. While fond enough of some servants, Angelica also made it quite plain that should a servant misbehave, their situation could change quickly. One anecdote from her journal indicates that one servant, instructed not to overpack, did indeed overpack, lied about it, and perhaps stole money from Angelica's niece, Mary McDuffie, who accompanied the Van Burens on their European trip. A young lady's maid named Desiree was supposed to accompany them on the next leg of their journey from France to Switzerland. Desiree had not only packed an extra bag, but had packed many other belongings into the luggage of the rest of the Van Buren family. Great was my indignation, Angelica wrote, to discover that Desiree had packed in addition a hat box, a square wooden box, and a carpet bag full of her things, which she was having stowed away upon the carriage. It seems she had been laying in supplies for 2 years with Mary's money, we now have good reason to believe. Desiree was paid and dismissed on the spot, and another servant, Louise, who was supposed to be leaving their service in France, took Desiree's spot for the next part of the journey. Though incompetent, as Angelica writes, Louise was not a thief and did follow orders to the best of her ability. Angelica very rarely had very positive things to say about the servants in her employ. She very clearly saw them as workers in her household, not as confidants or friends. The Van Burens' move to New York followed the end of the Mexican-American War, as well as Abraham's service during the war as paymaster. As he reached the rank of second lieutenant colonel during the war, Angelica referred to her husband in writing as the colonel. Similarly, she referred to her father-in-law as the president. In 1849, their third son and last child was born, Travis Coles. In 1852, Angelica's father died, leaving Angelica the annual profits as well as property and approximately 200 enslaved persons from one of his plantations called the Fork. So what did Angelica do with her inheritance? From what we have thus far discovered, the Van Burens took advantage of the plantation profits until they sold the Fork and its slaves in 1859 to pay debts. However, Angelica's travel journals indicate that they granted the house and at least some of the land to her brother Matthew, writing, "The Colonel, Smith, and I went down to John's office and sent up for Mr. Livingston to conclude the legal arrangements for transferring my right to the house and western tracts of land to Matt, which was effected." From this statement, it appears that Angelica, her husband, and both Smith and John Van Buren were all involved in this arrangement. South Carolina property laws at the time allowed women to own but not entirely control their own property. We also know that Abraham brought a manservant, a slave, with him during his service in the Mexican-American War. Without having any evidence to the contrary, I feel it is safe to say that Angelica and her husband were comfortable and complicit in the institution of slavery, quite a departure from the views and practices of their cousin-in-law, Christina. In 1854, Angelica and Abraham took their sons, as well as Angelica's niece, Mary Singleton McDuffie, who later married Confederate General Wade Hampton, on a trip to Europe. These travel journals, digitized and available online through the University of South Carolina, provide some of the most important insights into Angelica's personality and daily life that we have available to us. While the initial impetus behind the trip was to provide her boys with a superior French education, the trip was very much one of sightseeing and pleasure as well. From these journals, about half of which I've gotten to read and transcribe, we learn not only about the elite Americans visiting European society and attending fancy parties, but they also reveal details about 19th century motherhood, servanthood, means and expenses of travel, pastimes, courtship, education, European opinions of American slavery, grieving, illness, and so much more. One of my favorite things to discover was that Angelica regarded her niece Mary, then in her early 20s, as a burden for the trip. Before their departure, Angelica outlined her concerns. Mary McDuffie, being very desirous of visiting Europe and having no other prospect of being gratified while unmarried, I have offered to take her with us, which, if I had considered only my own comfort and pleasure, ought never to have done. It is pleasant and enlivening to have a young person of one's party on an expedition of this sort, but Mary is not one of those to add to one's pleasures or lessen one's cares. Whereas the charge of a young lady involves serious consequences, to modify our plans to suit her inclinations, to have the comforts and privileges which, if the only lady of the party, would be exclusively mine, to chaperone her to many a gay resort which will have no attractions for me, to nurse and be detained by her if ill, all of which I have considered. Yet I shall make the one more sacrifice for her, for whom I've made so many before. Not only does this highlight aspects of Angelica's hope for the trip, but it also lets us know that Mary, another planter aristocratic Southern belle, was perhaps a bit of a handful. Angelica was very aware of the troubles that would accompany chaperoning a young woman abroad. Mary's mother, also named Mary, died only a week after giving birth to her daughter, and her father, George McDuffie, eventual governor of South Carolina, died in 1851. Angelica felt duty-bound to let Mary come along for the trip, especially because it appears that Mary, using her own fortune, helped to pay for it. Angelica's worries about Mary's presence on the trip played out as Angelica anticipated. Even before their departure from New York, Angelica noted, "Mary rushes from one engagement to another, each more unpleasant than the last." While in Paris, the women decided to do some shopping, and Mary's wishes superseded Angelica's. As Angelica wrote, "Mary, as usual, got the advantage of me. She managed to choose her dress first, and by the time her difficult and undecided taste was satisfied, Mrs. Ray, the seamstress, seemed tired, and I did not like to weary her with my dress, so I was measured and attained the promise mine should be completed on Wednesday." It was also necessary for Mary to see a dentist while in Paris, who they visited several times on their trip. And while touring a castle in Switzerland, Mary repeatedly proclaimed she was too scared to visit the dungeons. Despite these repeated complaints, however, Angelica also understood her niece's personality and did her best to please her. At one point in Switzerland, Angelica noted that Mary likes to be where the world is, which Angelica acknowledged, as I should at her age perhaps. Angelica's role in chaperoning a young lady abroad became particularly significant when it came to the case of a man named Count Botemer, who the Van Burens and Mary encountered in Switzerland. Angelica relates in her journal that this count, who they met at a dinner party, was an acquaintance of only 10 days, who had only seen the Van Burens a dozen times, and who had a total of 3 hours conversation with Mary, wanted to court her. According to Angelica's descriptions and anecdotes, this man appears to have been a bit of a doofus. He was blunt, obnoxious, used very poor English, repeatedly mispronounced Mary's last name, and worst of all, was maybe divorced, meaning he was perhaps still legally married. Despite Mary's polite cold shoulder toward the man, he nonetheless left a note where the Van Burens were staying, hoping to enter into correspondence with Mary. As Angelica made known to him, this was very inappropriate. She explained that American customs of courtship were different from Europe. As politely and calmly as I could, I told him he had been misinformed as to customs of our country as respects young ladies, who, though allowed the utmost liberty, rarely abused it, and that with us it was considered indecorous for a young lady to enter into a correspondence with unmarried men, even when well acquainted, that my niece had of course told me all that had passed and shown me the letter as is duty bound. As Angelica outlined, letter writing between a young lady and a suitor was reserved only for very serious relationships, such as engagements. And if you ask me, Mary was probably glad to have had this excuse to decline the attention of the older, obnoxious man with a questionable reputation. These journals also provide the opportunity to examine Angelica's experiences and views on motherhood. She clearly loved her 3 sons deeply and was very much attentive to their needs. She writes often of her affection for them, especially in helping them pack for the trip, attending to them when sick, bathing and dressing them, and her heartfelt goodbye when leaving her 2 eldest in Sion, Switzerland, for school before continuing on to Italy. She noted the emotional nature of their parting in October of 1854, writing, "Bid my adieu this morning with a sad heart. Unless they become desperately ill, and I am summoned to them, I shall not, according to our present plans, see them until May. Instead of waiting to set out in the carriage, I walked to the school and stayed with them till the carriage stopped for me. Poor boys, they bore the parting bravely. Singleton, noticing the tremor in my voice, said to me as I would to Trev, 'Mother, don't cry.' I commit them with perfect confidence to the merciful care of that kind Father, who has always watched over us so kindly hitherto. Yet it is a great trial to separate from them, particularly Maddie, who is not yet 10, and has so much been an invalid lately. As Angelica had written earlier in this entry, Martin was only recently recovering from a bout of dysentery, a recent diagnosis for the many instances of upset stomach he had suffered from on their journey. Angelica clearly felt deep affection for her children and their well-being. However, her journals also reveal frustrations that accompany the responsibilities of mothering in the 19th century. After arriving in France from England, Angelica noted that their train journey to Paris was rather uncomfortable, at least for her. The children and I and Louise and all the carpet bags and dressing cases in addition in one car. Singleton and Martin sat in one seat while I took turns with the Louise to hold Trav. I felt bitterly enough as I heard the shouts of laughter from the next car and strove to understand where the family lay, which caused me to always bear the whole share of discomfort. Angelica clearly felt frustrated that she was shut up in one car compartment with the children, the servant, and the bags, while the rest of the party they were traveling with, including her husband and niece, were having a good time next door. Angelica also performed the tasks of child and sick care. Angelica writes that when Travis had an upset stomach, I performed the unpleasant duty of attending to his events in the railway. Thank God that chapter is closed. But it wasn't. Throughout the journey, Angelica had many further illnesses to attend to, including one particularly gruesome week in July where Travis, Martin, and the servant Louise were all ill. Angelica wrote, "At this moment, I am sitting up watching 3 invalids." When everyone was sick, including the nursemaid to the children, Angelica was the one to take care of everyone. Even while on vacation, Angelica managed these often unpleasant aspects of running a household. Angelica's journals also reveal to us that she was a practicing Christian to a certain extent. Although her writing is not permeated with deep religious reflections like Christina's, certain moments in Angelica's travels demonstrate her to believe in God. She refers many times to attending church services throughout their journey, and in moments of distress, Angelica called out to God in her journal. This is shown most prominently in her journal entries surrounding the time of her brother's death in August of 1854, writing, "O God, forgive me. My heart rebels against thy stern chastisement. If I question thy merciful providence, I sorrow for those who have lost their protection. Heaven knows how I got to my room. I fell on the floor but did not faint, but sobbed in a way that terrified me." A month later, the next entry in her journal read, "A long gap in my journal. My nervous system became so deranged for the shock of that dreadful news. This has subsided now, and I trust I shall not again experience another such attack of nervousness. Vain would be every blessing which Providence can bestow to confer happiness if accompanied by these feelings." Angelica apologized to God for questioning his plan while also grieving for the wife and children her brother left behind. I want to end my discussion of Angelica's journals with a couple of anecdotes that touch on the topic of slavery in the 19th century. While touring the dungeons of Chillon Castle in Switzerland, Angelica encountered a group of English women among their group who criticized the American institution of slavery. I saw them sign to each other. She had pretended to show how Americans treat black men. Angelica was clearly affronted by their actions and commented in her journal, "Let her relate the story of these dungeons and show how Europeans treated white men." Angelica's response is clearly defensive. Instead of acknowledging the cruelty of American slavery, she writes her own condemnation for European treatment of prisoners. Additionally, while Angelica did not reflect too often on the church services she attended, she found one service in Switzerland in October worth commenting on, writing, "The clergyman today, in a mission-begging sermon, included the fugitive slaves among the objects of his charity. His further remarks were checked by a demonstration of dissatisfaction in the congregation." I found this passage puzzling. How did Angelica feel about this sermon? Was this clergyman discussing fugitive slaves in the Americas or in Europe? After much digging, I found that uncovering the history of slavery in Switzerland is rather difficult. Many private Swiss companies profited from the Atlantic slave trade, and I have seen hints of studies that show that Swiss mercenaries went to the Americas for purposes of upholding slave laws. Evidence on this matter was very difficult to come by, however. Whatever the context, Angelica notes that the crowd reacted rather negatively to this sermon, which adds further complexity to the issue. Were Swiss people generally unhappy with interfering with slavery? Regardless of the exact situation or Angelica's unknown feelings on the subject, she certainly found it worth noting in her journal. We know that her father posted many ads for runaway slaves in newspapers, and given the fact that the fork, the plantation she inherited, was still under her possession at this time, and that the U.S. was growing ever divided on the topic of slavery, it is unsurprising that this subject was of keen interest to Angelica. Around the time of her trip to Europe, Angelica's sister was caught up in the difficult situation of seeking divorce from a violent husband. She was successful, but unable to retain the full rights to the property her husband had taken over upon their marriage. The situation impacted Angelica greatly, and we know that in the 1860s she began to be involved in more reform and charity societies in New York City. Only years after their European excursion, the nation broke out in civil war. Angelica, a Southern-born woman living in New York City, probably would have felt quite divided during this time. We have little evidence of her feelings on the matter, but we do know that she did send blankets to Confederate soldiers in a POW camp in Elmira, New York, one that was notorious for poor and unsanitary conditions. And I would like to add, while on the topic of the Civil War, that we unfortunately have no writings to or from Christina during this time. As she was anti-slavery and a reform-minded individual, however, we can imagine that Christina would have made many efforts for the cause of the Union. Angelica's charitable interests are also reflected in books that have been saved from her personal collection, now housed by the University of South Carolina. These lists reveal that Angelica had an interest in history, literature, and charity. Containing the works of James Fenimore Cooper, Robert Burns, Thomas Gray, as well as women writers such as Catherine Maria Sedgwick and Grace Aguilar, this book list also shows that in the 1850s, Angelica acquired works of a more moralistic nature. Among these are Household Words, edited by Charles Dickens, a magazine which, among other things, exposed social ills. She was also in possession of Alton Locke, Tailor and Poet, and Autobiography by Charles Kingsley, who was famous for writing about political and religious concerns. It is clear that in her middle age, Angelica took up more serious reading matter. As a member of elite New York society, she would have been in a good position to dedicate time and money to various charitable organizations. One last thing I would like to discuss about Angelica is that she took on the care of her niece Anna after John Van Buren's death in 1866. Anna was traveling back to New York from Europe with her father and cousin Ellen James when John fell ill and died on board ship. Anna was only around 24 years old at the time and unmarried, so she went to live with Angelica, Abraham, and their sons. In 1870, Angelica and Abraham hosted Anna's wedding to Edward Alexander Dewar in their home, according to a letter from Angelica to Christina. Angelica wrote to her cousin, "I hope that you received the invitation sent you to Anna's wedding. At her earnest desire, the marriage was solemnized in our drawing room. Bishop Potter performed the ceremony, and her uncle, the colonel, gave her away. Only 100 persons were invited of the nearest relations and the most intimate friends." As was the case with Mary McDuffie, Angelica took a young niece under her wing as a chaperone and parent substitute. She evidently took her family duties seriously, no matter the personal cost or effort. Despite the relatively small size of this society wedding, I am sure that no expense was spared, nor any detail left unattended. What I find most striking in examining the lives of Christina and Angelica is that they were clearly very different people. They reveal a wide depth of women's experiences in American life in the 19th century. Christina's circumstances and lifestyle were indeed much more mild than that of many of her Van Buren relations. While she received many letters from cousins visiting abroad and sightseeing in Europe, we have no evidence that Christina herself went or even desired to go to Europe. While she was left with money upon her parents' deaths, her income without having married would have been quite modestly middle class. And this wasn't from a lack of wishing to be married either. Her letters to Caroline reveal that she seemingly did want to be married one day. As she wrote at the age of 26, "I have about determined to join the sisterhood. I believe I shall write my name Christina Cantine Spinster. You will laugh when you read this, but I feel very much like crying when I write it." Despite not fulfilling this dream, Christina was dedicated to both her church and charitable work and enjoyed the company of friends and family. In comparison, Angelica lived a very glamorous and different life, attending fancy schools, marrying the president's son, meeting with European royalty, mothering 3 sons, playing billiards with her husband and friends, organizing a high society New York wedding, and helping with charitable organizations in the largest city in the country. Despite these differences, their lives were crucially intertwined within the family of Martin Van Buren, an often forgotten president who was crucial in shaping American political life in the 19th century. Never remarrying, Van Buren sought out both Christina and Angelica to fill the role of hostess of his home. While one declined and the other accepted, they both exhibited qualities necessary for the position: intelligence, organization, and dedication to a man they cared for greatly. These women, hailing from very different worlds and worldviews, represent the socio-political climate Van Buren was trying to bridge his whole life. We often wonder here at the park what conversation would have looked like at this family dinner table, which included a reform-minded evangelical, a Southern belle, and one of the most notorious fence walkers in American political history. The telling of Van Buren's story is made much fuller in including these two women who are very close to him. In the centennial year of the 19th Amendment, I feel honored to have helped explore their stories, helping to demonstrate that while a house may have been purchased by a man, women were the ones with the power to run it. Thank you.